All right, with that, I bid you all welcome and would like to say on behalf of the Kettle Moraine Land Trust that we appreciate your participation here. And we look forward to maintaining our connection, our friendship with one another. So thank you very much. My name is Greg Reisky. I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of the Land Trust. With me here also today is Sue Heffron, our Program Manager. I will tell you that the program in front of us this evening is based on a presentation that I originally delivered 3.5 years ago at the Wild Things Conference at the UIC Forum in Chicago. I have updated the program a little bit, but I did want to give a nod to Wild Things. It's a biennial conference for the conservation community throughout the region, from southwestern Michigan all the way through, southeastern Wisconsin, covering the Chicago region and beyond. Typically, they meet every 2 years. The 2021 edition will be virtual. It will be online and will occur across 4 weekends in the month of February. So if you're interested in participating in that, learning what there is to find out from the practitioners of ecological restoration and other conservation related issues, you're welcome to contact us at the Land Trust and we'll be happy to share with you information about Wild Things. So the presentation here in front of you today, I will confess, does not reflect vigorous science on my part. Rather, it is based on a review of relevant literature that's been available and direct observation. I have been enchanted by the Midwest Oak Savanna since approximately 1990, when I was introduced to this particular plant community, this diverse ecosystem, by the likes of Stephen Packard and Wayne Lampa, Ralph Thornton, Bill Jordan, and others who were engaged in this sort of renaissance of ecological restoration and the awakening of the mystique of the Oak Savanna. What you're looking at here is a view from the Prairie Trail across Glacial Park in Ringwood, Illinois, just a little bit south of the state line, just south of Richmond. And again, it affords an amazing view, the setting sun across the relatively flat but slightly rolling landscape, prairie grasses occupying much of the ground layer vegetation and a scattering of trees. But I should say that when I talk about moving toward a savanna flora, it's important to understand what I mean by that. Essentially, a flora is simply a list of all of the species that are present in a particular locale. Now you compare that with the vegetation of an area, and whereas the flora is just a comprehensive list, the vegetation, to a botanist, refers to the combinations or associations of the different plant species and the relative abundance of each species. So it's a much more nuanced sort of approach. So you look, for example, at the vegetation of Wisconsin, the seminal work of John T. Curtis in 1959. He goes through a detailed ordination of plant communities, not just a list of species, but a careful look at how they relate to one another. Now, the reason I feel that we need to move toward a flora of the oak savanna is that whereas for the dry mesic forests of southern Wisconsin or the tallgrass prairies of the upper Midwest, we don't have indicator species that are generally agreed upon that people say, oh yeah, that's a savanna plant. Well, because the savanna was not really part of our imagination until recently. When I was, going through my early schooling, we learned that, there's the eastern deciduous forest, and there's the tall grass prairie, and then the short grass prairie across the plains, and then onto the Rocky Mountains. Well, no one ever told me about savanna when I was going to school. This is something that came to me as I began to explore natural areas and plant communities a little bit later in life, after I completed my schooling. Of course, I've never completed my schooling, and I hope you haven't either. So a savanna, in the words of John Curtis, is a plant community where trees are a component, but where their density is so low that it allows grasses and other herbaceous vegetation to become the actual dominance of the system, of the community. So the trees are the most conspicuous species, but the grasses and forbs, in a botanical sense, are the more important species. And that simply means that they are present in greater abundance. They may not be as conspicuous, but they are there in numbers. So in the Midwest, an oak savanna is a kind of wooded or timbered community, but it often has a grass-like ground cover. The ground layer vegetation is typically going to be composed of a variety of grass-like species, sedges, perhaps some reeds or rushes, and true grasses as well. And the classification systems that have most generally been adopted in recent years are based on canopy cover. So how much of the sky is being blocked by the upper level leaves of the trees in midsummer. So if it's at 0 to 10%, we say, well, that's got to be a prairie, there's no trees. If it's more than 80%, we would say, well, that's a forest, that's a closed forest system. It's a very shady environment. And then that in-between area, that 10 to 80%, some authorities, used to adopt the notion that that's all savanna, 10% to 80%, 70%, whatever, it's arbitrary. It's an artificial system. But more recently, the general consensus is that if it's 10 to 50% canopy cover, we'll call it a savanna. If it's more than 50% but less than 80%, we'll call that a woodland. Previously, woodland was a term generically applied to most any timbered site. So that's how it was that that whole middle range of the spectrum got referred to as savanna. But the important thing to remember here is that there's no hard and fast rule, and that these classification systems are inherently artificial. It doesn't make them wrong or fake or bad. It just means that they were developed through human artifice. It's something people made up so that we can make sense of the natural world around us. So when we're talking about savanna, we're talking about widely spaced trees, an open canopy. But when you gauge that, when you measure it, how large an area are you really talking about? Does it have to be a minimum of 10 acres and you're looking at the total average of that 10 acres? Do you have pockets within an 80-acre parcel that are wide open and full of prairie plants, and other areas that are more densely shaded and have some woodland species? Again, you have to kind of average this out over the context of a given specific site. So how did the savanna come to be? What are the driving forces, the ecological functions that create a situation in nature where a savanna can develop? Well, rainfall is certainly important. If you've got more than 35 inches of annual precipitation in a mid-continent setting such as ours, chances are you will have woody trees. You'll have tree growth. Forests develop where there's an abundance of moisture throughout the growing season. So more or less 35 inches of precipitation per year or more, you'll end up with a timbered system. Less than 35 inches, and you're more likely to have a grassland. Now that's just speaking in broad terms of the biomes of North America. And sure enough, wouldn't you know it, we're right around 35 inches of average annual precipitation in the upper Midwest. Last couple of years, we've been well in excess of that, but we're talking about long-term climate, not fluctuations in weather year to year. So we're on the edge. We're in between these two great biomes of the eastern deciduous forest and the tall grass prairie, and that's where our savannas developed. But it's more than just precipitation. It's more than just the four-season climate that we have here. Fire is a major contributor to the determination of plant composition in any given system in our area. So I want to thank my friend Tom Simpson, who developed this graphic originally, and I think it very elegantly explains the influence of fire and topography on the incidence of certain species of oaks or other trees. So to explain the diagram, I'll use my mouse, and I think that you'll be able to follow along. The direction of the prevailing winds are, in this case, left to right. We could say it's west to east. Flat land. The fires can move rapidly. They can burn hot. They're going through prairie. This is a grassland area. Flat ground, drier to the west, tends to support prairie grasses. So you have high influence of fire here in the west. Where you begin to get a little bit of break in the topography, maybe you've got a ravine system here, maybe you've got a little bit of a ridge coming up here. There on the edge, bur oaks, Quercus macrocarpa, can begin to establish themselves. These are oak tree species that have a thick, corky bark. They are tolerant of hotter, more frequent fires than most other tree species. So it was the bur oaks that tended to be the dominant tree species in the savannas that were located between the prairie and the uplands, which were often dominated by white oaks in pre-settlement times. So white oaks, Quercus alba, prefer to have a well-drained soil, typically. Same could be said for black oaks, more about them in a little while. But again, the break in the terrain causes disruptions in the flow of the fire across the landscape. And so does the presence of the bur oaks. They tend to break up the movement of fire to allow it to cool slightly, to move more slowly, and to burn less thoroughly. So the white oaks could get established in these areas that still burned frequently, but with less intensity and less frequency than in the prairie. So you're seeing a decrease in fire influence as you go from left to right. And as you go into a ravine system, you're going to have sheltered slopes where the fires don't burn hot downhill. Fires may race uphill at a hot rate, but less so if having to move downhill. And in the shelter of those slopes, red oaks could get established, the more mesophytic oak species of our region, and also sugar maples. Sugar maples are highly susceptible to fires. Where there's a refuge from fire, sugar maples can get established, and you have a more mesophytic woodland or forest area. And then swamp white oaks may occur in moist areas that may be more sheltered from the fire. And still, all of these systems will periodically burn. So the critical thing with the Midwest Oak Savanna is that it was an ecosystem that was lost before science had the discipline of ecology to interpret it. So these systems were compromised pretty rapidly. The oak savannas were prime real estate for the pioneers to establish their homesteads. You had shade, which was helpful not only for the people, but for the livestock. You had timber, which was necessary for firewood, for building, for constructing tools. You also had game. The savannas were filled by and large with nut trees and other fruit-bearing trees that were attractive to game animals. So from, long before European settlers arrived here, human beings were making use of the savanna as a very desirable place to live. So once the European settlers arrived, they put a stop to the fires that the Native Americans had traditionally set on an annual basis. They harvested a lot of timber. They turned loose a lot of livestock into the woods, into the savannas for grazing. They plowed up the areas between the trees or after taking down the trees and grubbing out stumps to put in their row crops. And they also put in miles and miles of drain tile. So the tiling dewatered the area and left it with an altered hydrology. So between all of these stressors, before we knew it, in a relative blink of an eye, even where the old oak trees, stood with their arms spread wide, the ground layer vegetation was gone, or it was altered. Here you see a photograph of a beautiful open-grown bur oak, and growing around it is nothing more than Hungarian brome, Bromus inermis. And that was one of the grasses that was brought over by the European settlers to feed their livestock. And it is not uncommon today for our remnant oak savannas to be devoid of most of the original ground layer vegetation. Even where the ancient oaks remain standing, it's very often just what you might call a brome savanna. So let's take a quick look at how we currently classify our local oak savanna ecosystems. And I turn to the Chicago Wilderness Terrestrial Community Classification System. I think it's a good and comprehensive and fairly accurate work. It's available online. They divide their oak savannas into essentially two broad soil types. Sand savannas are one, but the other would be this fine textured soil savanna, which is further divided according to the moisture content in the area. So your fine textured soil savannas may be dry mesic, meaning middle of the hydrological spectrum, mesic right in the middle, or wet mesic, a little bit more toward the wetter side. And then sand savannas, they categorize into dry and dry mesic. It's not common to have a sandy system that is very wet unless you're in, the dunes area near Lake Michigan. So here you see a barrens type savanna with widely spaced trees, and you've got a stand of bracken fern, Pteridium equilinum, here under the oaks. And in truth, that bracken fern is more likely to occur in a sand savanna. But this savanna, bluff savanna at Waterfall Glen Forest Preserve in DuPage County, Illinois, has quite an impressive assemblage of plants from a variety of different typical stations. So it's especially rich, uncommonly so. So we'll take a quick look at a sand savanna. This is Necedah National Wildlife Refuge in central Wisconsin. And the sand savannas, as I said, are typically occupying sandy soils that are well drained. It's typically a relatively flat area of the terrain, generally dominated by black oak, Quercus velutina. And these occur in central Wisconsin in the sandy regions. A few in east central Illinois, for example, the Kankakee Sands region, and notably along the interdunal areas near to Lake Michigan. So we are not going to spend a lot of time discussing the sand savannas because with the limited time that we've got, we will need to focus on the fine textured soil savannas, which are more common throughout southeastern Wisconsin and northeastern Illinois. And these occur predominantly on clay soils, soils that have very fine particulate matter, and they tend to be somewhat poorly drained in spite of being upland. You tend to get more runoff. You don't get as much ready accumulation of organic material because of the hard-packed nature of the clay substrate. Although a lot of our kames, our glacial hills, do contain a fair amount of gravel, which facilitates drainage. But typically our ice contact landforms, these glacial areas, the Kettle Moraine region, notably, and the Valparaiso moraines of northeastern Illinois. And these are mostly middle of the hydrological spectrum, slightly on the dry side. So let's take a quick look at the canopy trees. We can actually start looking at some of the species that make up these communities. So here you've got a photo of a beautiful old white oak, not far from Lake Beulah in northern Walworth County. One of the most typical trees of the savanna, as we noted discussing the fire regimen, is Quercus macrocarpa, or bur oak. Again, fire resilience and its ability to sort of be a prairie pioneer. It can establish itself into the prairie matrix with a little help from squirrels and blue jays and other acorn caching animals. Again, the trees in the white oak tribe, bur oak, white oak, and others, tend to have sweeter acorns than those in the black oak tribe. They mature in 1 year rather than in 2 years, as with the black oaks and red oaks. So they accumulate fewer tannins and are a little bit less bitter. Makes them very attractive to acorn-eating animals, and especially those that cache their acorns and end up planting them for us. In the black oak or red oak tribe, we have Quercus ellipsoidalis, or Hills oak. A lot of folks in Wisconsin call this northern pin oak. I tend to go with Hills oak so as not to confuse it with the other pin oak, Quercus palustris, which tends to be limited to flatwoods and other moister areas. Quercus alba, white oak, is a very important component. It's not reproducing as well in the modern era, but historical records suggest that it was quite prevalent during the time of European settlement of the region in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. Red oak, Quercus rubra, is a little bit more mesophytic. It likes conditions that aren't quite as dry as the others. It's a little more shade tolerant. So as we move along that fire Katina, that spectrum, Quercus rubra is more likely to occur when the fires are slightly less intense. And black oak, Quercus velutina, as we mentioned, it occurs predominantly as the dominant in sand savannas, but also at that savanna at Waterfall Glen, Bluff Savanna. It occurs there as well. The hickories are important, and we have two species that are prevalent in this particular region, shagbark hickory, Caria ovata, and bitternut hickory, Caria cordiformis. I think black oak is a part of this system. It tends to prefer moister areas, but I think it would occur in the mesic savannas, and especially along alluvial stream beds and other waterways that may have flowed through our savannas. And then I left a question mark after American elm, as I did after hackberry, Ulmus americana and Celtis occidentalis. We do sometimes find large specimens of these species in savanna remnants. And again, although they are more mesophytic in general, you know, you might say the same would have been true of Fraxinus americana, white ash, probably an important component in pre-settlement times, although we don't see them so much now. But again, on that spectrum between savanna and woodland, that's probably where you'd find the elm and the hackberry. So let's step down from the canopy, much like our prehistoric ancestors may have done in human evolution. Down out of the canopy, swinging down from the trees, checking out the shrubs and understory trees before we embark upon our upright walk through the grasslands. So the understory components certainly would have included American hazelnut. That was presumed to be prevalent in pre-settlement times, although we don't see very much of it in the wild today. Understory tree, hop hornbeam, also known as ironwood, Ostrea virginiana. A couple of dogwoods, Cornus alternifolia, the pagoda dogwood or alternate leaf dogwood. Like the hackberry, this might prefer a more mesophytic area, might be a little more shade tolerant, but I suspect it was a component of our savannas, at least those that occurred on slopes and nearer to moisture. Gray dogwood, you know, it's one of our native dogwoods, and those who are managing prairies probably bemoan its presence, think it's a weedy, an invasive kind of native plant. But it must have had a natural niche in here somewhere, and I think the savanna is probably where it was most at home. Gray dogwood, Cornus racemosa. Wild black cherry, Prunus americana. I'm sorry, that's wild plum, Prunus americana. Definitely shrub species, thicket forming. This too was probably very common in the savannas. And again, I think the savanna in many ways is a somewhat of a remnant of artificial selection. That is to say, human beings had a hand in shaping the composition of this plant community. As I mentioned before, Native Americans are very likely to have made good use of a savanna environment and probably selected in favor of nut trees that either fed them directly or attracted game that they could hunt, and also fruit trees such as the wild plum. And then chokecherry, Prunus virginiana, another thicket-forming member of the Prunus genus and likely a member of the early savannas. I want to include Illinois rose, Rosa satigera. You may argue that it's not really a shrub, it's a cane. It's more woody than herbaceous, and I'm particularly fond of it, so we'll include it in this list. And then here, pictured, we have elderberry, Sambucus canadensis. This particular photo from the Turner Tract near Genoa City, Wisconsin, part of the Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge. This in southeastern Walworth County. Once again, fruit that is edible and produces enough berries that they could be preserved or juiced. A number of viburnums would have been present as a shrub layer within these savannas. The maple-leaved arrowwood, viburnum acerifolium, nannyberry, viburnum montego, black haw, viburnum prunifolium, and I think I didn't have room to list it, but I would even include viburnum raffinesquianum, or the downy arrowwood, probably also a member of the community. And then prickly ash, Xanthoxylum americanum, is one that we tend to think of as aggressive. A lot of people who are doing savanna restoration these days are deliberately removing this plant, or at least reducing its numbers. It's my contention that it was a natural component of this community, but is super abundant in certain sites that were heavily grazed, because grazing animals would have been more likely to avoid those prickly and bitter branches. It's worth noting that in the early stages of savanna restoration, a lot of us, and I count myself as guilty, ignored the shrub layer. You know, we were thinking in terms of the ancient venerable oaks and how to bring the wildflowers back, and how to bring back enough grasses to support, you know, the use of prescribed fire. And we tended to forget the shrubs. But I think they're an important component. I think most land managers today recognize that. So a closer look at Corylus americana, the hazel. As I mentioned, it's a nut-bearing shrub that was prevalent at the time that the public land surveyors came through the region. In the 1830s and 1840s, it was very common for the survey notes to record the presence of various oaks and hazel brush. Hazel was a constant companion of the oaks in those surveyor notes. It's in the Betulaceae. You see the catkins forming on the photo on the right, elongating in the early spring. And then on the left, you see the fruits in full form, just starting to ripen. If you want to collect hazel for propagation, if you want to collect the nuts, you're going to have to get careful with the squirrels. Their timing is going to be critical because the squirrels have a tendency to harvest them just before you plant to. But it also can be propagated through cuttings. So it's not always necessary to have the fruit to be able to reproduce the shrub. Another look at the Illinois rose. It's one of the more robust native roses. Again, it can be somewhat assertive under certain circumstances. It's easy to tell from the other native roses because it typically has 3 leaflets or 5. Seldom, if ever, 7 or more. Typically 3 to 5. It's particularly showy in the lower Des Plaines River Valley in northeastern Illinois, and southwest suburbs of Chicago. I don't see as much of it, you know, here in southern Wisconsin, and maybe that's one of the reasons they call it Illinois rose. Although if you get down to Missouri, they call it prairie rose. So there might be a little bit of geographic rivalry there. So, as I mentioned earlier, the science community, the practitioners, the academics have really not agreed upon a clear-cut set of what we might otherwise call indicator species. You know, we can say that there are indicator species for, you know, certain forest types or for certain prairie types. No one has dared suggest that there are oak savanna indicator species. Even John Curtis, who really documented at some length the vegetation of the savannas, or the oak openings, as he called them, he stated that of the prevalent species in the oak woodlands, only the oxeye sunflower or false sunflower, Heliopsis helianthoides, reaches its optimum there. So none of the other species that he studied reached their peak within a savanna setting. They were always, even more abundant under a different kind of plant community. But again, bear in mind that by the 1950s, when Curtis and his undergrad students conducted their studies and assembled the vegetation of Wisconsin, the ground layer vegetation was by and large lost. But here's a quick list of some of the other ground layer species that we might expect to see. The giant hyssops, the purple and the yellow, thimbleweed, Anemone virginianum, columbine, wild hyacinth. Now it's interesting, we tend to think of columbine as more of a forest flower and wild hyacinth of more of a prairie flower. But again, they may have actually found their ideal home in the dappled sun of the savanna. Tall bellflower was almost certainly a component. Short-headed bracted sedge, Carex cephalophora, and rosy sedge, a curly-styled wood sedge, Carex rosea. Purple Joe pieweed, Eutrochium purpureum. At least two of the myanthemum species, the stellatum and the racemosum, the starry and the feathery Solomon's plumes. Wood betony, again, that was a plant that I first learned as being a prairie plant. Certainly it grows in prairies, but again, they do call it wood betony, perhaps for a reason. Brown-eyed Susan, we see a lot in the savannas. It's in part because it's easily established in a restoration. So there tends to be a little bit of a bias toward those species that are showy, those species that are easy to collect seed from, that are easy to seed process, and that are likely to germinate and establish well. And then a couple of species of horse gentian as well, Triosteum. So we'll take a closer look at just a few of these. This is the purple giant hyssop, Agastache scrofulariaceae. I also mentioned the yellow giant hyssop, Agastache nematoides, which is also equally likely to be found in oak savanna. This photo, I believe, is from Pleasant Valley Conservation Area in McHenry County. Wild hyacinth, Camassia psiloides, spring flowering, low growing. A lot of savanna species, it seems to me, tend to grow a little taller than, say, their comparable woodland species or forest-grown species. And again, I think that's simply a function of available light. But the wild hyacinth is one of those spring flowers. So it begins to flower before all of the trees have come out and leaf. Eutrochium purpureum, purple Joe pieweed. Many of us learned that as Eupatorium purpureum. I know that in McHenry County, for example, the Conservation District no longer includes this species in their savanna seed mixes. But the reason is not that it doesn't belong in the savannas, it's that its wind-blown seeds will find their way there anyway, and it can be a little overly abundant if you seed it supplementally. I mentioned wood betony, another spring flowering plant. This one has an interesting life history. It is hemiparasitic. It tends to attach to the roots or connect to the roots through mycorrhizae of grasses and some other plants. So it still photosynthesizes, but it draws some nutrition from host plants as well. I mentioned a couple of horse gentians. This is Triosteum aurantiacum. I believe that's the late horse gentian. This from the Oak Openings Nature Preserve in Lake County, Illinois. So, okay, these are all species that, we may encounter in savanna remnants or savanna restorations in our region. But I wanted to try to figure out what are the most prevalent or what are the most characteristic species specific to the fine textured soil savannas. So I thought, well, okay, how would one go about figuring that out? We don't have really intact reference ecosystems on a landscape scale that we can turn to and say, here are all the representative species that we want to include in our restoration, or here are the species that are indicative of a remnant relic savanna. So in the absence of that, how can we try to figure out what are the most prevalent, the most characteristic? So I went to the literature. I went to the savanna seed list that the McHenry County Conservation District uses for their restorations. That list includes 52 species of 52 species in total, 32 of which are forbs, and 13 of which are grasses and sedges. So that's a pretty varied and detailed list. My friend Pete Jackson, in his work published in Erigenia in the winter of 2009, titled Temporal and Spatial Vegetation Dynamics at Middle Fork Savanna, yielded 26 characteristic species. And Middle Fork Savanna is distinctive as being one of the most intact tall grass or black soil type savannas. A little less clay content, a little more loamy, silty. So it's a rich example. The Pruka, Henderson, and Sedges lists that are cited on this slide all came from research done at the Pleasant Valley Conservancy in Dane County, Wisconsin. It's a state natural area. It is owned by the prairie enthusiasts in large part, and then sections of it are under private ownership with a conservation easement with the prairie enthusiasts. And there's a lot of really good research available from that group at Pleasant Valley. So Pruka's list included 58 species. Henderson's had 13 species that he considered to be characteristic. And then the list of sedges that we got there included 49 species, including others in the Cyperaceae family, not just the carex. Curtis himself listed 46 species that he considered prevalent. I did a piece way back in 1993 for the Midwest Oak Savanna conference that was organized by the US EPA and held at Northeastern Illinois University. And in that, I listed 68 species that I called archetypal, they were listed with associates of other plants that occurred in savannas, and they bore, certain characteristics that either they bloomed early in the year before the trees leafed out, or they bloomed later in the year at sufficient height that they were likely to thrive above the shoulders of other understory plants. Several other characteristics that taken together I thought made for an archetypical savanna plant. And then in 2000, I did a more comprehensive list of species, again, based on the literature, Savanna Associates. And I did that as part of a class in methods in ecological restoration. So that had a broad list of potential components. So I gathered together information from all these various sources. And then considered, what did they have in common? Where was the commonality? How often was this particular species cited? So I wintered it down to 17 graminoid species and 56 wildflowers or forbs. From there, I scored them, and I offered a weighted score that was based in part on the types of communities in which they would likely occur. And if it was more akin to the fine textured soil savannas of northeastern Illinois, because this was Illinois work at the time, that gave them a little extra weight. So here's another just beautiful photo from Almond Lake Forest Preserve in Lake County, Illinois, near Gray's Lake. Again, just an autumn sunset in a nice, diverse site. So that sets us up for my top 5 lists. And what I've done is I've endeavored to offer up the 5 highest ranking graminoid species, counting down from 5 to 1. And then I'll do the same for the forbs. But with a caveat, there are some honorable mentions in there as well. So again, I have a disclaimer on the bottom of this page. It says that it is subjective to the arbitrary and capricious evaluation of the sole judge and jury of this endeavor. So anyway, I was able to take liberties with this because it's not peer reviewed. So these species tied for the number 5 ranking. They were more or less equal in their numeric evaluation. Broadleafed panic grass, Panicum latifolium. Straight-styled wood sedge, Carex radiata. And that surprised me because I would have thought Carex rosea would have been more common in the savanna. And then short-headed bracted sedge, Carex cephalophora, which you see here on the right. Number 4, common oak sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. I know it's not a welcome addition to a number of sites as you get a little bit further north from where we are in southeast Wisconsin, but it is a welcome addition in the savannas south of the state line. Bottlebrush grass, which again used to be Hystrix patula, and now they're calling it Elymus hystrix, lumping it in with the other ryegrasses in the genus. And that's depicted here on the right. And then spreading oval sedge, Carex normalis, the number 2 ranked prevalent characteristic graminoid species of the fine textured oak savannas. And number 1, you may have guessed it, it's another ryegrass, silky wild rye, Elymus villosus. It is a favorite of restorationists because it's easily established, it's easily harvested. It's not terribly long-lived, so even where it forms a fairly dense stand, such as you see here at the Pleasant Valley, McHenry County, Illinois site, it will yield to other slightly more conservative species over time. Silky wild rye, what's not to like? Now to the forbs. One of the species that I wanted to give honorable mention was shorts aster, Symphyotrichum shortii. It's common in high quality areas in the lower Des Plaines River Valley, often associating with elm-leaved goldenrod, sometimes with Illinois rose. It tends to like a calcareous environment, so if your bedrock is close to the surface, if your mineral content soil is primarily ground limestone and dolomite, this is one that you may find in those kinds of stations. Late figwort, Scrophularia marilandica. I don't know why I like this plant so much, probably because its little mahogany flowers are so tiny that they're overlooked. But the plant is so robust. It's tall with a square stem. And besides, when you practice your botanical Latin, Scrophularia marilandica just has a lyrical lilt to it. Violet wood sorrel. Once again, something that I had predominantly known from prairies before I started doing more work in the savannas, and recognized that it also likes, a little bit of dappled shade. Oxalis violacea. Turk's cap lily or Michigan lily, Lilium michiganense. Once again, wet prairies, but also moister areas of your mesic or wet mesic savannas. Subject to deer pressure, deer browse, but it seems to be making a comeback. It's very showy and certainly a fan favorite. This one's from Pleasant Valley, the McHenry County conservation area. So with that, we can move to our top 10 list. So at number 10, the common carrion flower, Smilex lesionura, which many would refer to as a vine, although it is herbaceous. Pale Indian plantain, perhaps not a surprise. Arnoglossum atriplicifolium, and here you see it depicted in the foreground with the sun shining through a temple of oaks at Bluff Savanna at Waterfall Glen Forest Preserve in DuPage County, shimmering on the rubbery leaves of pale Indian plantain. Next up, number 8, starry campion, Silene stellata. Again, a fan favorite. Showy, mid-height. It'll grow, waist high to shoulder high with those beautiful lacy petals. Silene stellata. Number 7, white wild lettuce, Brynanthes alba. Pretty highly ranked. So we'll go to number 6, purple milkweed. Asclepias purpurescens, and I understand in Wisconsin it is state listed. Threatened or endangered, I'm not sure, but here's a photo of it taken at Almond Marsh in Lake County, Illinois. Beautiful, deep, rich purple color. Number 5, yellow pimpernel, one of my favorites, Tenidia integerrima. And this occurs in the savannas along Lake Michigan, in some of the shoreline ravines. We have it at Pleasant Valley Conservation Area in McHenry County, in a wide open savanna with a lot of sun, right on the edge of a wet prairie sedge meadow complex, but right under an oak crown. We also have yellow pimpernel in the kettle at Beulah Bluff Preserve, quite an abundance of it there. Number 4 is golden Alexanders, Zizia aurea, a plant of wide ecological amplitude, but certainly one that will enjoy a moist savanna environment. Earlier I mentioned elm-leaved goldenrod, Solidago ulmifolia, as an associate of Short's aster. And certainly we see that very commonly in savanna remnants. And again, perhaps because it's a late flowering bloom, it's a little more conspicuous. But definitely a part of most restorations in the southeast Wisconsin, northeast Illinois region. So let's move on. The anticipation is growing. Number 2, Culver's root, Veronicastrum virginicum. Once again, at home in prairies, wet prairies, edge of sedge meadows, but also in the occasional shade and moisture of the mesic savanna. We're on Castrum virginicum. Again, a fan favorite. And then, number 1, shooting star, Primula media. Used to be called dodecatheon media. We see it commonly in prairies, high quality prairies, I should say. But again, it is supposed to have been just as much at home in the Midwest Oak Savanna. So with that, we're about to wrap up. I want to make sure that you have my email address. It is greg@kmlandtrust.org. And you're welcome to visit our website for other events and news upcoming. We have a donate button on the website where we would happily receive your donation for this work. Sorry, I see that Sue has raised her hand. So
I have raised my hand. I just want to make sure several people put notes in the chat room, and I want to make sure their questions were answered.
Good. Yeah.
So if you would like to ask them of Greg now, that would be great.
Yes, or you may, read the questions to me, or if people want to, or if you want to call on people, give them the option to unmute, and they can ask themselves, or you can read their question.
Sure. How about, let's start with Kathleen. Did you get your question answered? You were interested in learning more about how to recognize characteristic savanna species?
I think his presentation was really good, and I do have a question for you, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So you probably know I'm working on illustrating an oak woodland habitat guide.
Yes, Kathy, I do.
Great. So I think you've probably added a couple of species to that list. Is it possible that you could email or Facebook me those top 10? I don't know that I took comprehensive notes while I was
yes. The short answer, Kathy, is yes. And in fact, I have a paper that I prepared to accompany this. And if I can find that, I can email you the paper that has tables of the key species that are listed.
That's and I could email you the list that I'm working on right now, and would love if you have anything that you think would add. That would be
great. We'll definitely follow up and talk offline. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Yeah, this is for everybody else. This is for the Field Museum.
Oh,
It's going to be one of their rapid guides. Only it's not going to be rapid. It's about 33 pages right now. Oops.
And for those of you who do not know Kathy Garnes, she is a well-accomplished botanical illustrator and has done remarkable work for the Nature Conservancy and for the Field Museum and for other local institutions. She's a longtime friend, and I'm delighted that she's participating in this today. So welcome, Kathy.
Aw, shucks.
good. Okay, Donna, right, Jack? Did you want to ask your questions of Greg?
Is this where Donna plans to plant royal catchfly under the serviceberry? And would pen sedge be a suitable companion to plant with the silene? The short answer is yes. I think all of those play well together. You know, the catchfly, the serviceberry, the silene, or the pen sedge, yes. The pen sedge may want to spread. It tends to spread vegetatively, but you can always divide it up if you wish. If it starts to get too aggressive, or if your catch fly starts to wither a little bit, you can pull it back.
Okay, anybody else have questions for Greg?
I have a comment. This is Pete. Greg, excellent presentation. That's my first comment. It's outstanding. I really enjoyed it. Having studied savanna flora myself a little bit, one of the things that's important to remember, and you touched on this, different species of herbs have different light tolerances or amplitudes. And so what I found at Middle Fork when I studied there is, there were a large number of the characteristic species there that had a wide range of light tolerance. And I think one of the interesting debates in the literature going back to the 1990s was, a lot of people tended to say, well, since I see elm-leaf goldenrod in the woods, it's a woodland species. Or if I see Culver's root in prairies, it's a prairie species. They just happen to be okay with partial shade conditions of savanna. But Packard was the guy who kind of said, well, wait a minute. Who says that, they're not potentially, if they're as abundant in a savanna as prairie or a woodland, maybe they're more of a savanna species. And when I looked at that, with my data, because I measured light a couple different ways in all my plots. And, there were a large number of species that were very happy in the middle of the light gradient. And so I kind of bought into his idea. And that's kind of one of the things that I touched on in my thesis was, and my list has a lot of overlap with yours, as I'm sure you know, Greg. So, I think it's, we can always debate some of these species forever, but, some of them, when you see them, you just go, that's a savanna indicator, But my point in my thesis was the more of those what we tend to call indicators loosely, the more of those species that you see at a given site, it increases your weight of evidence that it's a savanna. So just the presence of a purple milkweed might not mean it's a savanna, but if you have purple milkweed and, you've got Tenidia, the yellow pimpernel, and some other characteristic species, you build up your evidence based on the number of species that you see that are characteristic of a savanna.
Well, what you say, Pete, is very much similar to the way we approach species identification of, say, an oak tree. How to determine if it's this species or that species. You don't look at just one characteristic. You look at as many diagnostic features taken together as you can. And so it is with the plant community. You don't look at one indicator, you look at it at the total picture.
Sure.
And I'm very mindful of what you had to say about light tolerance. And I noticed in your comment in the chat to Donna that, the royal catchfly, Silene regata, is, a light-loving plant, one that wants to have more sun than, say, the pen sedge. And again, you have to kind of look at the total picture, because how much shade is it getting from the serviceberry? Is it getting shade from the pines to the south? Is it going to get more shade or less shade in the future as plants fill in, grow, and change? So when you're looking at installing in a native plant garden in the home landscape, you may have different considerations than you would have in an ecological restoration of a natural area. And just as you look at the light regimen, I think the hydrology is similarly effective on a spectrum. You may have a more well-drained area here, and it may be, collecting more moisture here. You have a clay pan or a sand lens under the surface, and that's going to affect your drainage patterns. And you may have a drought year. One of the things I learned from Wayne Lampa was when you put together a seed mix, rather than say this is a dry mesic savanna mix or this is a wet mesic savanna mix, and go only with those plants that occur at that end of the hydrological spectrum. Instead, if it's a dry mix, throw in some that are more mesic or even tolerant of wetter conditions. And if it's a wet mesic mix, throw in some of those species that may prefer a drier environment. Because very often the plants will get established underground, but not express themselves unless the above ground conditions are suitable to their preferences. So in a drought year, even in a wet mesic mix, you may get that dry species to express itself. And similarly, if you've got heavy precipitation one year, you may get those wetter species showing up in a drier site. So hedging, using diversity as a hedge against adversity.
And if I may, Greg, one more point. I strongly concur with something that you emphasized, and that is there's a tendency, especially when we look at these canopy cover scales and defining communities, and we say, well, savannas 10 to 50. There's a tendency, I think, to think of a savanna as a uniform habitat insofar as its canopy is concerned. But as you pointed out, savanna, and this is what I learned when I studied at Middle Fork, the high quality unit there is basically comprised of dense woodland, prairie openings, wet meadow, savanna, canopy wise, savanna, all of the above. And so you look at the species list and it's huge. And you think, wow, savannas really are diverse. But the reason, what's driving that diversity is the diversity of habitat, light, moisture, and so on. And you made that point. And that's, that to me, a savanna is, it's not a uniform community. It's almost by definition variable in terms of light and moisture and so on.
Thanks, Pete. I like that a lot. And I'm going to take it one step further. And going back to that paper I did in 1993, I referred to the savanna as a roving element of the landscape, suggesting that, at times of more frequent or intense fire, it might an area might shift more toward prairie. In the absence of fire, in the presence of nut-bearing caching animals, the woods could invade the prairie, and the savanna may actually have been moving around the landscape over a period of hundreds or thousands of years. So it's hard for us to pinpoint within the time scale of human life what's really going on in the world.
It looks like we have one more question from Lucas. Is the woodland edge a savanna? My guess, no, but certain overlap in plant communities. Does it have to be a specific size?
Well, I think that definition depends in large part on your purpose in defining it. If you are a land manager who is responsible for, thousands of acres, your perspective on that is going to be different than if you have a 5-acre, woodlot behind your house. And you'll be managing differently and defining things differently depending on the scale of your situation. So, a woodland edge, I think it depends. What's the quality of the woodland? Is it an oak system that with a little more open canopy would support, the species that we consider to be savanna denizens? Is it a denser woodland that contains a lot of mesophytic species, maples and cherries, and I would have said ash before the borer. That's going to be a different kind of environment. And we're looking at it in terms of the lens of the longer lived trees and thinking about what to do about the shorter lived perennial herbaceous layer. So how you define it depends on, in part, on the scope of your palette and in part on the purpose of your definition, restoration, whatever your land management plan calls for. I hope that answers your question. And then how do you not overmanage a natural area? When do you know to stop? Well, I said that we don't have any reference ecosystems, for the oak savanna, but even in the absence of, landscape scale reference ecosystem, there may be similar sites that you can use as a model. Is there a healthy, functioning, balanced example that you can look at and say, it looks kind of like this? Then you set that up as your sort of objective or your goal. And from there, as you get closer to that, your management regimen relaxes, but you're never done. It's always going to require maintenance because there are countless stressors that affect these environments. Invasive species, seeds rain in from all sides. The hydrology may shift because of a neighbor's practice. You may or may not be able to apply fire at the frequency you'd like. Are you looking in terms of a 10-year span of time, a 50-year, 100-year span of time? All of these are factors that make it very difficult to say or prescribe a template type of response. There's no cookie cutter answer to restoration. There's no recipe that's applicable to every site. So with that, I think I'll stop the recording. And before I do, I just want to thank everybody one more time from Kettle Moraine Land Trust.